Okay, so you want to own a shopping mall. And the first thing you should know is that the number on the lease is almost never the number that matters. Not for you, not for your tenants, and definitely not for the bank. Two things to hold on to before we go anywhere. The first is that the biggest tenants in your mall, the ones occupying the most square footage by an enormous margin, are the ones paying you the least. Some of them, in some deals, effectively pay nothing at all, and that is not a negotiating failure. It is the design. The second is stranger. There is a single clause buried in most mall leases that means one store closing can legally reduce the rent of stores that never closed. One tenant walks out, and your income falls in units that are still open and still selling. We will get to it because it is the mechanism that turns a struggling mall into a dead one. But we start with the rent, because the rent is where the misunderstanding lives. Here is the thesis, and everything else is proof. A mall does not rent space. A mall manufactures foot traffic and sells it by the square foot. Once you see that, every strange thing about this business snaps into focus. So let's look at the price list. In a shopping center, base rent is not one number. It is a ladder, and where you sit on it has almost nothing to do with how much space you take. Anchor tenants, the department stores, and large format retailers that occupy the enormous boxes at either end, commonly pay somewhere in the range of $8 to $15 per square foot. Inline tenants, the smaller shops along the corridor, commonly pay $25 to $60 per square foot, or more, depending on the quality of the center. Read that again, with the areas attached. The anchor might occupy 100,000 square feet at $10. The clothing store occupies 2,000 square feet at $45. So the anchor takes 50 times the space and pays roughly 4.5 times the rate less per foot. And it gets more lopsided. Investment-grade anchors frequently sign 20 to 30-year leases with minimal percentage rent and reduced or capped common area charges. Many of those leases were signed 15 or 20 years ago at rates substantially below today's market, and they are still running. So why on earth would you sign that? Because the anchor is not your customer. The anchor is your product. Nobody drives 20 minutes to visit a 2,000 square foot accessory shop. They drive to the department store, the grocery, the cinema, the gym. Then, once they are inside the building, they walk past 40 other stores to get there. The anchor generates the crowd. The inline tenants pay for access to it. You are not renting the anchor a box. You are buying traffic wholesale at $10 a foot and reselling it retail at $45. That single sentence explains the entire physical layout of every mall you have ever walked through. The anchors are always at the ends, never in the middle, because the walk between them is the product you are selling, and every store along that walk is priced according to how much of that walk it captures. If you have ever wondered why the mall makes you traverse the whole building to get from one big store to another, that is not bad design. That is the entire business model, poured in concrete. Now, the base rent ladder is only the first layer, and here is where tenants get surprised. Retail leases in malls are almost universally triple net. That means on top of base rent, the tenant pays their proportional share of the property's operating expenses. common area maintenance, property taxes, insurance. Common area maintenance covers everything nobody rents, but everybody uses. The parking lot lighting, resurfacing and security, the corridors, the food court seating, janitorial, the heating and cooling of all that shared space. Published ranges put common area charges at roughly $5 to $12 per square foot for shopping centers, and industry guidance notes that in enclosed malls, specifically, these charges can reach $30 per square foot or more. Your share is calculated by the percentage of the mall's total leasable area you occupy. And now go back to the anchor, who occupies more square footage than anybody, and who negotiated a reduced or capped common area contribution. If the largest occupant pays a discounted share of the shared costs, that shortfall does not evaporate. It sits in the pool that the remaining tenants are dividing. The small store is not just paying more per square foot in base rent. It is also carrying a disproportionate share of the building. Now, you could stop the video here and you would already understand more about mall economics than most people who shop in one. Everything so far is just a pricing structure, and pricing structures are the easy part. The part that makes this business genuinely unusual is not how the mall charges rent. It is that in a mall, the landlord is not really a landlord at all, because there is one more line in that lease, and it changes the relationship entirely. It is called percentage rent. Under a percentage rent clause, the tenant pays additional rent equal to a percentage of their gross sales above a threshold. The percentage typically runs 5 to 8%. The threshold is called the breakpoint. Most leases use what is called a natural breakpoint, and the formula is beautifully simple. Divide the annual base rent by the percentage rate. That is your breakpoint. Run it. A store with $60,000 a year in base rent and a 6% rate has a natural breakpoint of $1 million in sales. If that store does $1.2 million, it pays 6% on the $200,000 above the line, $12,000 in extra rent. And notice what the natural breakpoint actually means. At exactly $1 million in sales, 6% of sales equals the base rent precisely. The formula is designed so that below the breakpoint you pay the fixed floor, and above it the landlord starts taking a cut of every additional dollar. In enclosed malls, this goes further than most people realize. Kiosks and smaller tenants often pay minimal base rent, but a higher percentage of sales, and some leases are structured as percentage rent only, with no base rent at all. Sit with what that means. A landlord with no base rent has no fixed income from that space. Their entire return depends on how much that tenant sells. Which is why the lease does not stop at the percentage. It also defines exactly what counts as gross sales, which sales are excluded, when the tenant must report, what the report must contain, penalties for underreporting, and the landlord's right to audit the tenant's books. Your landlord has audit rights over your sales figures. If you know somebody who is about to sign a lease in a shopping center, this is the part to send them. Most people think they are renting a room. They are entering a revenue-sharing agreement with reporting obligations and an audit clause. And it explains something you have probably noticed without naming it. Why does the mall run holiday events, hire a Santa, book the car show, Run the marketing fund that tenants contribute to, not out of generosity. When your tenants' sales cross the breakpoint, their sales are your revenue. The mall's marketing department is not a cost center. It is a revenue driver with a direct contractual line to the income statement. The landlord and the tenant are partners in a way that exists in almost no other kind of real estate. When the store has a good December, the landlord has a good December, which means, unavoidably, that when the store has a bad year, so does the landlord. And that brings us to the clause I promised you. Most inline leases include a co-tenancy provision. There are two main kinds. An opening co-tenancy says a tenant does not have to open until specified other tenants are open. An operating co-tenancy gives the tenant rights if specified tenants close, or if overall occupancy falls below a defined threshold. Those rights typically include paying reduced rent, sometimes switching to percentage-only rent, and in some cases, terminating the lease entirely. Now watch the sequence, because this is how malls actually die, and it is nothing like the story people tell. The anchor closes. Maybe a bankruptcy, maybe a chain rationalizing its footprint. That box goes dark. On its own, you have lost a tenant who was paying $10 a foot, which is not catastrophic. But the co-tenancy clauses trigger. Inline tenants who are still open, still selling, still fully operational, now have a contractual right to reduced rent. Their traffic fell because the anchor left, and their lease anticipated exactly this. Some dropped to percentage only, some exercise termination rights and leave. Now occupancy falls further, which can trip co-tenancy thresholds in other leases, which reduces more rent, which reduces the marketing budget and maintenance spending because the common area pool just shrank, which makes the mall less pleasant, which reduces traffic, which reduces sales, which reduces percentage rent, which was tied to those sales. One tenant left the building, and the income of the entire property reset downward in a chain, contractually, without anyone else closing a single door. That is the difference between a vacancy and a collapse. In an office building, one empty floor is one empty floor. In a mall, one empty box is a trigger. And this is why mall performance splits so violently rather than declining gently. Look at the current numbers. Class A malls, the ones doing $500 or more in annual sales per square foot, run vacancy around 5.6%. Class B malls at $300 to $500 run around 9%. Class C malls under $300 run about 13.3%. Green Street occupancy data shows a similar spread, with A-rated malls around 95% occupied, B malls at 89%, and C-rated and below dropping to 72%. The valuation gap is even more extreme. Of roughly 900 malls remaining in the country, the top 100 account for about half of the entire sector's value. The bottom 350 account for around 10%. Same asset class, same building type, completely different businesses. At the top end, the numbers are genuinely excellent. Trophy properties are reporting occupancy above 95%. Tenant sales up sharply since 2019, and sales per square foot well past $1,000 at the strongest locations. Financing follows performance, and issuance of mortgage-backed securities tied to top malls doubled to around $8 billion in a recent year. At the bottom end, roughly 40 malls close each year. More than 11% of loans tied to regional malls are delinquent according to TREP, and once a mall closes, it sits empty for an average of nearly 4 years. Now, I want to be careful here, because the easy story is that the mall is dead and e-commerce killed it. The data does not actually support that. In 2025, 5,640 mall stores closed and 9,760 new ones opened. That is a net gain. The industry went through a brutal contraction, from roughly 1,500 enclosed malls at the mid-2000s peak down to around 900. And the survivors are in many cases producing rising occupancy and growing net operating income. Tenant mix shifted hard toward food, entertainment, health, wellness, and services. What died was not the mall. It was the mall that had nothing to sell except the walk between 2 department stores. So let's put a year on it, both ways. In the good scenario, you own a Class A property in a dense, affluent market. Your anchors are healthy, and your co-tenancy clauses are sleeping. Your inline tenants are comfortably above their breakpoints, which means percentage rent is flowing, which means your revenue rises with their sales without you renegotiating anything. Occupancy cost sits inside the 6 to 10% of sales that tenants can sustain, so your rent roll is not fragile. And here is the quiet advantage. Almost nobody builds new enclosed malls anymore. Supply is effectively fixed and shrinking. If you own a strong one, reduced competition does work for you, whether or not you do anything clever. In the realistic scenario, you own a Class B mall in a secondary market. Nothing dramatic happens. Foot traffic at B malls has been running well below pre-pandemic levels, while Class A properties have nearly recovered. Your sales per square foot drift down, which quietly pushes tenants' occupancy cost above that 6 to 10% band, which means at renewal they ask for less rent or less space, and they have the leverage because you have empty units. Then a chain rationalizes its footprint nationally, and your anchor is on the list, not because of anything you did, a decision made in another state about a portfolio that happens to include your building. The clauses trigger, the income resets, the maintenance budget shrinks, the property is worth a fraction of what it was, and the loan against it does not shrink to match. Nothing burned down. Your parking lot still fills on a Saturday in December. The food court is still busy at lunch. You just discovered that you were never really selling square footage. You were selling a crowd on lease terms that assumed the crowd would keep showing up, to tenants who had already written down what happens if it doesn't. That is the whole business in one line. In almost every other kind of property, the landlord's job is to collect rent from a tenant. Here the landlord's job is to produce the customer, deliver them to the tenant's door, take a cut of what they spend, and audit the count. Which means the honest question was never whether people still go to malls. 900 buildings and billions of visits say they do. The question is whether the crowd walking past your particular door is large enough that everybody along that corridor can afford to keep paying for the privilege of standing next to it. This video is general education about how an industry works, not business, financial, real estate, or investment advice. If you want to check any of it, publicly traded mall owners disclose occupancy, tenant sales per square foot, and lease structures in their quarterly and annual filings, all free to read.